Hello, everybody. My name is Shimat Joseph. I am a turfgrass and ornamental entomologist with University of Georgia. Previously, I worked in California for about 5 years, and I worked with Lygus bug and others. In strawberries, I worked on Lygus bug with Mark Bolda. So he asked me to give a summary or important research that we did when I was there. That's what I'm trying to do. So before I start, I want to acknowledge all the pest control advisors, growers I worked with, and also student assistants who helped me to make the research possible. The funding sources, agrochemical companies, IR4 program, and all supported my program while I was in California. So I just want to give my contact information up front. Um, so you can see over here my email address, that is svjoseph@uga.edu, and you can always call me anytime. My phone number is 470-629-6287. So let's get started with Lygus bug biology or life cycle. So eggs are laid on the um, inside, is kind of inserted into the leaf tissue, and you can see barrel-shaped eggs that's basically thrusted out inside the tissue, and all that you will see is a operculum or the cap that basically pops and out when the uh, it hatches. So eggs hatches to the first instars and go through 5 stages, and you can see as they increase in say stage, uh, it starts from light greenish color, then light green color, then turn out to be brown, and they develop into an adult. So another peculiar thing to know about Lycus bug is their egg mouthpart. So their mouthpart is like a straw-like mouthpart that composed of needles. So there are 4 needles. They arrange those needles to secrete saliva. They spit into the tissue when they feed, and a little bit digestion occurs, and they suck it up, and that's how they feed. Lygus bug is known for its feeding on seeds. So there, that particular group, like ADA, that merits, sorry, this particular group is well known as a seed feeder. So the damage what we see in the on the strawberries is cat facing, basically irregular shaped, misformed, disformed shaped um, strawberries, the fruit. So what's really happening is that they're trying to feed on the seed as they mature, and the same time the fruit is continuously growing and becomes deformed, and that's how you see the cat facing damage. So early phases of fruit set, that's a time that is most vulnerable to like its bug feeding. So another thing to keep in mind that not all the damage that occurs is related to Lygus bug feeding. There could be other environmental factors that can contribute, um, uh, lack of pollination, and that also can lead to disformed or kind of misshapen fruits. So just to start with um, the phenology of Lygus bug in the Central Coast area. So they overwinter. They go through the winter during say November, December, January, February period as adults. So they go through as adults, and there are warmer days, so they come out time to time and become active, and they can start laying eggs. So they overwinter as adults during the winter time, and this slide pretty much shows that they come out like late February, March, and start laying eggs. The adults comes and start laying eggs. Eggs hatches in the warmer days, and gradually they go through a generation, and until mid June or sometime late May, depending on the, how mild the weather's, how warm or mild the winter was. You start seeing the first generation coming up, um, and started appearing, and start laying eggs. So mid June, you start seeing the nymphs appearing. That is second generation, and they grow very little quicker because it's really hot and warmer for them. And you start seeing another set coming in late August. So it's considered that we start seeing big numbers emerging in June, nymphal generation, that's a time that you need to think about management, especially for Lycus bug. They utilize a lot of weeds, so they are polyphagous, meaning they feed on weeds of multiple plant families. And you can see there are a lot of weeds active in the winter time, and also in the springtime and in summer. Um, so these are some of the weeds that you'll see active early part of the year, that is in the winter time, like radishes, mustards, and the filari, some of the weeds that you see. And there are other groups of weeds that are all also active um, in the springtime, like chickweeds and shepherd spurs, um, groundsel, etc. So early February to May period, filari, wild radish, mustards, and common chickweeds, they're all very common in our region, in the Central Coast region. And they utilize that, and you'll find them in the ditches closer to the strawberry fields. And that is something you need to keep in mind. These weeds harbor their population early on. They grow in these weeds. um, this is another area that you see weeds growing closer to the strawberry field. So this is another photo where you can see mustard uh, uh, weeds growing very close to the strawberry fields, and they actually feed on them. They are attracted to those flowers, and they feed on the seeds as they develop. This is on malva. You are seeing the same. Malva is also very common and abundant in our region, especially in adjacent areas surrounding the fields. So this is some data to show from Barlow and Dr. Godfrey. This is done in southern part of the California, but you can see that they utilized a wide variety of wheat plants, and they survive on them, especially alfalfa and all the way to common groundsel. Um, So I was interested in looking at their movement. The idea is that they develop in the weeds, so how fast they can move. Because I have observed that the nymphs, especially the larger nymphs, walk. They have a capability to walk. Adults are most likely to fly on the warmer days, but nymphs can also walk. They can just cross from this area, from the wheat patch, and get into the fields. It's basically just give a walk. So I was kind of interested in looking at that, and we did these experiments, some experiments in the lab, and we found that yes, they are indeed capable of walking in 75 to 80 degree Fahrenheit, and you can see about 100, close to 50 to 100 centimeters they can walk. Also did some studies in the field just to see how they respond to temperature in terms of their movement. And what we are seeing is that they walk further as the temperature goes up. This is on fourth and 15th stars. They're bigger nymphs, and you can see their movement. So they are capable of walking, and adults, we know that they fly in the field. So now let me talk about some of the management studies that we did in last during 2016, 17, and in 2015, 16, and 17. So this includes an efficacy trial. So one trial where we looked at how to compare buckwhack with insecticide use, and also another study that we looked at electrostatic sprayer and compared with conventional sprayer. So here in the insecticide efficacy trial that we conducted in 2016, these are the different treatments that we had. So Avant, that's what we are interested in, was not registered at this moment. And it is an old chemistry, but not utilized in strawberries. So we were interested in that. We got some IR4 funding to look at this. Actara and Danitol, they are pyrethroid and a neonicotinoid and a pyrethroid. B-leaf is another insecticide as a different chemistry, flunocimide, um, that has anti-feedin properties. Rymon is basically um, growth regulator, insect growth regulator, and we looked at that in combination with the neonicotinoid and also um, a pyrethroid. So I was fortunate to work with the newer insecticides like Sequoia, sulfoxiflor, and Civando. Um, so that Civando was in the early stage, and Sequoia was, we did few studies at that point, but still early, newer chemistries, not registered at this moment when we did these experiments. So I am fortunate to work with those two newer insecticides as well. So insecticides were applied as a tractor-mounted sprayer at 150 gallons per acre. Two sprays were made. Um, we sampled regular intervals. As you can see, just beat samples that we used. We also sampled fruits, to look at the cat-faced fruits about 21 days after second application that we did. So jumping into the data, this is adults, Lygus-Bug adults that you'll see in the y-axis. The x-axis is sampling period, and you can see that control had a higher number of adults in our samples, and pretty much all the treatments looked really good in terms of suppressing the Lygus adults. But you can see this particular line here, that is basically Sivanto. You can see the effects didn't last that long. After some point, the numbers were very high, was not different from control. On the names, here you will see more numbers were there in the control, and all other treatments were looking better. Um, Especially the Sequoia, if you look at the Sequoia, the numbers were very low. That is a green line that you can see over here. And Ryman and the Brigade is also looking a lot better in this trial. So overall, all the insecticides were looking good, including Sivanto and Sequoia. Avant, the higher rate, was looking a lot better in this case, and we know that pyrethroids and neonicotinoids has a good efficacy. So they were also looking good. Looking at cat facing, this is control here, untreated control. If you compare, you can see that Sequoia, we saw lesser cat faced fruits. Predators are very common in our system. That is the big-eyed bug, minute pirate bug, damsel bugs. They're all common in the strawberry system. And you can see that their numbers were lower with the use of pyrethroid one treatment. Um, Overall, and you can see here brigade or danitol, start seeing the numbers go down statistically. Um, but Sivanto, we didn't see any difference. Even Sequoia was looking good. Both Avant high level treatment we saw is not different from untreated control. Spiders very similar. You can see Brigade or Danito. We start seeing some numbers going down. But otherwise, all other insecticides were comparable to untreated control. Now, moving on to a comparison study where we looked at bug whack and insecticide. So in this case, we used commercial, so grower used well-maintained equipment here. So the bug whack you can see over here, that's exactly that we used, and the sprayer the grower is using in the field. So here, these are the treatments. Insecticide we used was Sequoia, and the bug whack is a vacuum commercial grower bug whack. That's what we used. We also had a treatment where we, as a standalone and also as a combination of insecticide and vacuum. So the water volume we used for insecticide application was 150 gallons. Two applications were made. For the um, um, vacuum, we did four applications at a weekly interval. And this is what you can see. We applied for these vacuums were done for 2 weeks at a week, twice a week. Sorry, twice a week. So vacuums were done twice a week for 2 weeks, and you can see a picture of how that's done. Okay, so with regard to sampling, it was a pretty standard sampling. Look at immediate control and also whether we are seeing a persistent control. That's what we try to look here. So here, this figure, this is adults on the y-axis, and this is where sampling. That's you see on the x-axis, and the yellow color is basically when we apply the insecticide, and the red arrow that you can see here is where the vacuum was applied. Um, so what you are seeing here is that untreated control, that's a blue line that has most of the bugs, and you'll see that the vacuum is the green one is not very different from the control. Um, But when you look at the spray that is Sequoia, you can see that the red is basically controlling over time. So there are statistically um, lower number of adults and the combination of vacuum and spray. So vacuum by alone didn't do well, but in combination, this so it is good, looking good. So what means that it's a sprayer is doing the and bringing the population down here. Looking at NIMS, very similar pattern. Um, you can see the the spray application that is Sequoia looking a lot better, and in combination with vacuum is also looking good. When vacuum alone, you see that it's kind of intermediate. Um, so after a short term, you start seeing that their statics different, definitely lower than a control, but over time it's going along with the control. So it's kind of for NIMS, it's kind of intermediate efficacy that we can say. With regard to cat facing, wherever we had spray, it looked a lot better. Vacuum alone, we didn't see any difference. So cat facing damage was not different from vacuum and untreated control. With the Sequoia application, we saw a significant reduction. With predators, no difference. We didn't see any difference whether vacuum or Sequoia. So it looks like Sequoia is more um, predator friendly to beneficials. Spiders, same thing. We didn't see any differences here. So this experiment we repeated another year. Okay, I'm not showing that data, and uh, we can we saw pretty much very similar pattern in terms of efficacy. So here what we did is we dumped all those adults that we got from the in this particular net, and we counted like how many intact adults, injured adults, and how many NIMS are there. So you can see that over time there are about close to 50, about 40 to 50 or around that number. We are seeing that um, intact adults, that's a blue, is that we saw with what I mean by intact adults is that their legs are not broken, they're live, you know. So we are collecting live in the bag, and you can see more than half were dead. Um, but it is also important that you have a bag and dispose that, because if you don't have a bag, you're basically releasing those adults back, and half of them that you suck up from the field. So now to move on, switch gears to another study where we looked at electrostatic sprayer and combination with conventional sprayer. These are the treatments. So what we are really interested is to look at increasing the water volume for electrostatic sprayer. So this grower basically did all the manipulation adjustments to make this happen. So typically the electrostatic sprayer works at 10 gallons per acre or even 15 maybe, around that range. Um, so he manipulated with the help with the company his system so that he can spray a little higher water volume. You can see all these other adjustments has to be made. So with the higher water volume, he can move faster and um, a little slower. I'm sorry, he can go a little slower and make that application. So conventional sprayer is basically the same. It didn't change here. So just shows the experiment how we did this, and the applications were done in the early in the morning, so that the wind is another criteria. We wanted to make sure that the wind is lower, so it's a kind of still, so that um, we can make the electrostatic sprayer application very effectively. So this is basically showing the sampling, the early to persistent long-term sampling, so short-term and long-term effects. That's what we're looking at here. So here the data on adults first, and you can see that the numbers were higher in the untreated control. And if you look at all the electrostatics water volume, different water volume, and also conventional sprayer that is red, all pretty much completely controlled the adult population compared to control. And that's what we're seeing. They're all effective. Looking at NIMS, very similar pattern. All the electrostatic uh, sprayer treatments and also the conventional control, regular conventional sprayer, also did a very good job. And again, I want to mention that we used Sequoia here as insecticide to do these studies. Okay, and you can see it is doing a really good job here. With regard to cat facing on the fruits, very similar. All the treatments was a significantly lower number of cat facing as compared to control, that is untreated, that you can see over in this figure. Predators, we didn't see any difference. So this is very encouraging, very interesting, in terms of their efficacy. So kind of says over and over that Sequoia is more has less effects on the beneficials. That's a very good thing. So it can provide an additional value um, and additional control, uh, in terms of controlling in terms of overall management as IPM for Lycus bugia. Spiders, very similar. We didn't see any difference between uncontrolled, controlled, uh, and control and other insecticide treatments. So summarize all the efficacy trial and vacuum and also static studies. What we are seeing is that Ryman, Sequoia, Sivanto, Belief, and Avant were effective against other Lycus bug. Sivanto provided in our trial, at least we saw some effects initially, but it was not long lasting as the numbers were creeping up and was not different from control. Avant was effective, especially the higher rate we saw, and definitely warrant a little more further look into that, and also see whether we can register for strawberry for Lycus control. Pyrethroids appear to have some effects, negative effects on beneficials. That's what we saw in this study. Um, Vacuum is kind of in between, I would say, not very clear from our study in terms of controlling Lygus, at least the equipment that we used. So it can vary with the equipments growers kindly have. I know how widespread is used for Lygus management. So this is something to keep in mind based on our study. We didn't saw a reliable control in as we are seeing what as we saw with the Sequoia that I showed the data. So it's based on the data. It looks like that we are not getting a level of control that we're expecting, or we think that we are getting with using a vacuum. Um, but you can see insecticides, especially Sequoia that we used, and also in the efficacy trial, other treatments were much more reliable in controlling the Lycus. So that's something that you need to keep in mind. Electrostatic sprayer has a lot of potential, as less water that you, even though we looked at 30 gallons, it's less water, and that increases the durability and sustainability of the equipment that we're using. Even though it's a little expensive in the beginning, it has a lot of good value, in terms of wear and tear and load of all those things, less fuel you need. So in terms of all those things, it's much more useful, um, and has a potential to grow into for Lygus management. Um, and we looked at Sequoia. Sequoia has a translaminar. It moves through the leaf. Um, it's uh, it's also contact insecticide. So it is that insecticide that we used also maybe has something to do with this. Um, but it has a contact effects too. So pyrethroids also should have some, if you know, should have some efficacy using electrostatic sprayer, and it was comparable to what you're seeing with the conventional sprayer. That's all I got, and I want to thank the growers specifically. The grower who helped me to do these studies with the electrostatic sprayer and also vacuum, so that we can look at the numbers and say what we see, and that's exactly what I have shown. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. I already showed my email address, that is svjoseph@uga.edu, and my phone number 470-629-6287. Contact me anytime if you have any questions on the presentation, and I'm more than happy to answer those. Okay, thank you.